Why don't we spend New Year's at my parents' place? Ben's suggestion seemed innocent, but I had no idea it would set everything in motion. Looking back, it feels like this simple question was the beginning of the unraveling of our lives. My name is Susan, a 35-year-old who used to have a promising career. Once I worked side by side with my husband Ben. We met at the same company, worked hard together, and eventually got married. But everything changed when I gave birth to our daughter, Emily. I decided to leave my job and focus on raising her, believing it was the best decision for our family. It wasn't easy though. I missed the rush of work, the sense of accomplishment. But I embraced my new role, pouring everything into being a mother and wife. Ben, on the other hand, continued with his career, growing distant over time. The suggestion to visit his parents for New Year's didn't seem like a big deal at first, but it tugged at a memory I couldn't shake. I recalled the first time I visited them when Emily was just 6. It wasn't exactly a warm welcome. His mother, with her sharp tongue and judgmental eyes, made it clear that I didn't meet her standards. That trip left a bitter taste, one I had quietly ignored for the sake of peace. But now, as we packed for another visit, that old unease crept back in. I looked at Ben, who seemed oblivious to my tension. He had no idea how much these trips weighed on me. For him, it was just family time. For me, it was a return to the place where I felt less like a wife and more like an outsider. As I packed Emily's clothes, my mind wandered back to the sacrifices I had made. I had left behind a career, a piece of my identity, and all I wanted was a bit of recognition for it. But I knew better than to expect that from Ben's family. This trip, like the ones before, would likely be filled with passive-aggressive comments, silent judgments, and endless expectations of me to cater to everyone's needs. Still, I said nothing. We were going, whether I liked it or not. As soon as we stepped through the door of Ben's parents' house, I could feel the weight of expectation settle over me like a heavy blanket. It was as if I had crossed some invisible line that transformed me from wife to servant. My mother-in-law didn't even wait for pleasantries before launching into her usual routine. "Isn't dinner ready yet?" she barked, her voice slicing through the air like a knife. I forced a smile, though my nerves were already frayed. "I'm working on it," I replied, hurrying toward the kitchen as though I were hired help, not a guest. She sighed dramatically, loud enough to make sure everyone heard. "Honestly, Ben, how do you put up with this? She's so slow." My heart sank. But before I could respond, Ben, who was already sinking into the couch, shrugged. "Yeah, I know. Most wives are quicker at getting things done." I swallowed the bitter retort rising in my throat. It wasn't the first time Ben had let his mother's comments slide, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. He never stepped in, never defended me. It was easier for him to stay quiet, to pretend that her constant jabs didn't sting. But for me, it was another reminder that I was on my own in this house. As I moved around the kitchen, I could feel my mother-in-law's gaze on me, every movement scrutinized. I knew what was coming next, and sure enough, she didn't disappoint. "After dinner, you'll need to clean the yard," she said, her tone making it clear this was not a request. "Then the closet, and don't forget the storage outside." I nodded, too tired to argue. New Year's was supposed to be a time to relax, but here I was, running through an endless list of tasks. Meanwhile, Ben remained glued to the television, offering no help, no support. His silence was louder than his mother's words. The tension in my chest tightened with every passing minute. I wanted to scream, to demand why it was always me expected to do everything, but I knew it wouldn't change anything. Ben would just shrug it off, his mother would double down on her criticisms, and I would be left standing there, feeling small and powerless. By the time I finished the tasks she'd given me, my entire body ached. I collapsed onto the living room couch, hoping for just a few minutes of peace. But as soon as I sat down, her voice rang out again. "Who said you could rest? Lunch isn't going to make itself." I glanced at Ben, who was still sprawled out in front of the TV, completely unconcerned with the way I was being treated. He didn't even look up. My frustration with him simmered beneath the surface, but there was no point in saying anything. He wouldn't take my side, not here. I rose to my feet, feeling the weight of their expectations pressing down on me once more. With every step, my anger grew. This wasn't just about his mother anymore. It was about Ben. It was about how he let this happen, time and time again, without a word of support. and I was starting to realize that I was done letting it happen. The next morning, it felt like my feet hadn't even hit the ground before my mother-in-law began barking orders again. No Happy New Year or any sign of warmth, just a long list of things that needed to be done. Clean the kitchen, tidy up the guest rooms, and don't forget to dust the shelves, she rattled off, her voice cold and commanding. I barely had time to respond before she turned away, already expecting me to follow through without a second thought. Ben, of course, was nowhere to be found, likely lounging in the living room with a drink in hand, letting his mother take charge of everything, except the work, of course. That, apparently, was my domain. I scrubbed the counters, the sound of dishes clinking and water running filling the empty space of my thoughts. My hands moved mechanically, but my mind was spinning. The resentment I'd been swallowing for so long began to bubble up, slowly at first, but steadily growing. I glanced out the window and saw Ben, sitting on the porch with a beer in hand, chatting with his father as if he had nothing to worry about. He hadn't lifted a finger since we'd arrived, not to help with Emily, not to offer assistance with the chores. Nothing. He was as useless as a shadow, always there, but never really doing anything. My chest tightened as I watched him, the bitterness rising to the surface. How did we get here? How did I end up carrying the weight of everything while he sat back, oblivious? He used to care, didn't he? But now it was as if he'd abandoned me to this life of endless tasks and unspoken expectations. I tried to shake the thoughts from my head, focusing on the work at hand, but the harder I tried to push it away, the more it clawed its way back. Don't forget to sweep the front steps. My mother-in-law's voice cut through my thoughts like a whip. I nodded, biting my tongue. What I wanted to say and what I could actually say were two very different things. By midday, I was already drained. My arms felt heavy, my legs sore from constantly being on my feet. Yet, there was no sign of relief. The work just seemed to stretch on forever, and the weight of it, both physical and emotional, was suffocating. I felt like I was drowning in tasks, and no one even noticed. Ben was still outside, laughing at some joke his father had made, completely detached from the reality I was trapped in. Each time I caught a glimpse of him, it stung a little more. How could he just sit there while I ran myself ragged? By the time I finished cleaning the closet, my body was screaming for a break. I sat down on the edge of the couch, trying to catch my breath for just a moment, but my rest was short-lived. Susan, lunch won't make itself. My mother-in-law's voice pierced through the living room like a shot. I clenched my fists, staring at the floor, trying to control the anger swelling inside me. Ben still hadn't moved, and the sight of him, so casual, so disconnected, pushed me to the edge. Why am I the only one working? Why is it always me? I rose to my feet, my body protesting with every movement. But it wasn't just the physical labor that weighed me down anymore. It was the realization that I was carrying all of it. The chores, the family's expectations, the unspoken burden of holding everything together while Ben did nothing. And I was growing tired of it. Very tired. It was late afternoon, and my body was on the verge of collapsing. The endless list of chores had taken every ounce of energy I had left, and yet, the demands kept coming. I had just returned from the store, after walking over 30 minutes each way because Ben had been drinking all day and couldn't drive. The moment I crossed the threshold, I heard her voice again. "What took you so long? You're slow with everything." I dropped the heavy grocery bags by the door, feeling a sharp sting in my back from carrying them all the way here. But before I could even take a breath, I heard something else, something that made my heart stop. "You're just like your mother," my mother-in-law sneered. "Always making excuses, always behind. No wonder you're so useless." At first, I thought she was talking to me, but then I heard the soft sound of a child's voice, my daughter Emily. "I'm sorry, Grandma," she said quietly. That's when it happened. The exhaustion that had weighed me down all day vanished in an instant, replaced by a fierce surge of adrenaline. I stood up, my legs suddenly filled with strength I didn't know I had, and stormed into the kitchen. My heart was pounding, and for the first time in a long while, I wasn't tired. I was furious. I found Emily standing there, clutching the inner pot of the rice cooker, her little hands trembling as she tried to follow her grandmother's orders. And there, sitting at the table, was my mother-in-law, her expression as cold and indifferent as ever. "What are you doing?" I demanded, my voice shaking with anger. Emily looked up at me, her eyes wide and scared. Grandma told me to cook the rice because she was hungry, she said in a small voice. She can't even do that properly, my mother-in-law cut in, her tone laced with contempt. Just like her mother. Useless. That was it. The words hit me like a slap to the face. I could handle the insults when they were directed at me, but this was too far. My hands clenched into fists, and I could feel the blood rushing in my ears. She's 6 years old, I said, my voice low but trembling with fury. How dare you treat her like this? How dare you make her feel like she's not enough? My mother-in-law stared at me, shocked that I was finally standing up to her. What are you saying? She stammered. A wife is a servant and her daughter is no different. That's how it is. No, that's not how it is, I shot back, my voice growing louder. I am not your servant and neither is my daughter. You've pushed me around for long enough, but this ends now. You don't get to treat us like this anymore. Her face turned red with rage, but I didn't care. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of her. I wasn't afraid of the consequences or what Ben would say or anything else. I heard a groan from behind me. Ben, still lying on the floor like a useless lump, finally reacting to my outburst. But I ignored him. My focus was entirely on the woman in front of me, the one who had been controlling and demeaning me for so long. I've done everything you've asked, I continued, my voice steady now, but I will not let you treat my daughter like this. She deserves better. I deserve better. My mother-in-law was speechless for once, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for words to throw back at me. But I had finally shattered the hold she had over me, and nothing she said could reach me now. I turned to Emily, who was still holding the rice pot, her eyes filled with tears. I bent down to her level and took her hand gently. Come on, sweetheart, I said softly. You don't have to do this anymore. As I led her out of the kitchen, I could hear the low murmurs of Ben and his mother behind me, but I didn't stop. I had reached my breaking point, and there was no going back. I walked out of the kitchen with Emily's small hand in mine, my heart pounding from the confrontation. The silence that followed was thick and heavy, but I didn't care. For the first time, I felt a sense of clarity. I had been pushed around for long enough, and I wasn't going to let it continue. But as I reached the living room, my mother-in-law's voice came crashing back, sharp and unforgiving. What did you just say to me? She hissed, standing up from the kitchen table and following us. Do you think you can just walk away? You don't get to talk back to me like that. I stopped in my tracks and turned to face her. I've done everything you've asked, I said, my voice steady but burning with anger. I've cooked, cleaned, and followed every order, but I won't stand by while you treat my daughter like a servant. I'm done. My mother-in-law's face flushed with rage, her eyes wide in disbelief. You're a wife. You do what you're told. That's how it works. If you want to stay in this family, you need to learn your place. No, that's not how this works anymore, I replied, my voice firm. I am not a servant and neither is Emily. I've had enough of this. You don't get to control me or my daughter. At this point, I expected Ben to step in, to say something, anything. But as usual, he remained silent, his eyes glued to the television like none of this concerned him. He didn't even look at me. That hurt more than anything. His silence felt like betrayal, as if he was telling me that I was on my own. I turned toward him, the frustration bubbling up again. Ben, are you just going to sit there and let her talk to us like this? I asked, my voice trembling with the weight of everything unsaid. He glanced at me briefly, then shrugged, muttering something under his breath before turning back to his drink. That was all I needed to know. He wasn't going to help. He never was. A cold realization settled in. It had always been like this. Me on my own, carrying the load while he stood by, indifferent. I couldn't take it anymore. I bent down to Emily, who had been standing quietly by my side, her little face worried and unsure. I looked into her eyes and asked softly, Emily, do you like being here? Do you like being with Grandma? Her answer came without hesitation, no, Mom. I nodded, unsurprised. My mother-in-law's harshness hadn't been lost on Emily. She saw it, felt it, just like I did. I took a deep breath, the decision I had been avoiding finally settling into place. Do you want to live with Grandma? I asked her, already knowing the answer. Emily shook her head firmly, her eyes filling with tears. No. I smiled at her response, a bittersweet relief washing over me. I had been holding on for so long, hoping things would change, hoping Ben would step up. But seeing my daughter like this, it was clear, this was no place for us. "What about Daddy?" I asked gently. Emily hesitated this time but eventually shook her head again. "No," she whispered. And that was it. The final push I needed. I stood up straight, feeling stronger than I had in years. I turned back to Ben, who was still pretending not to notice the storm brewing around him. "We're leaving," I said, my voice steady and sure. At this, Ben finally looked up, startled. "What do you mean? You can't just leave." "I can, and I will," I said, my heart pounding, but my resolve unwavering. "I'm done being treated like this. Emily deserves better, and so do I." My mother-in-law let out a laugh, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "You'll come crawling back," she sneered. "You can't make it on your own." I stared at her, no longer afraid, no longer held down by her words. "We'll see about that." I reached for Emily's hand, and without another glance back, we headed for the door. My legs felt lighter with each step, and though the road ahead would be uncertain, I knew one thing for sure. I was finally standing up for myself, and I wasn't going back. The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of calm. The decision I had been struggling with for so long had finally settled in my mind. I was leaving. There was no doubt, no hesitation, no going back. I lay there for a moment, listening to the quiet sounds of the house, knowing it would be the last time I'd hear them from this place. I quietly got up and started packing our things. Emily was still asleep, her small frame curled up under the blanket. I didn't want to wake her just yet. This day wasn't going to be easy, but it was necessary. I folded her clothes neatly into a bag, my hands moving methodically, trying to focus on the task at hand and not the emotions swirling inside me. Once I had packed everything, I took a deep breath and made my way to the kitchen. Ben and his mother were already there, talking casually as if nothing had happened the day before, as if everything was normal, but today things were different. I walked over to the kettle, pouring water into the pot to make tea. The familiar motions felt surreal, like I was watching myself from a distance. My mother-in-law glanced at me briefly but didn't say anything, assuming I was simply falling back into line, ready to serve as usual. I prepared the tea and brought the cups over to the table, placing one in front of Ben. He reached for it, but before he could lift it to his lips, I snatched it back. His confused expression said it all. He still didn't understand what was coming. Without a word, I tilted the cup and poured the tea right over his head. The liquid was cool by then, but it wasn't about the temperature. It was about the gesture. It was my way of saying I was done. Done with the silent suffering. Done with being treated like I didn't matter. Done with the version of myself that I had allowed them to see. "What the hell?" Ben jumped up, wiping the tea from his hair, his face a mixture of shock and anger. I stood there, calm and collected, as if nothing had happened. "I'm not doing this anymore," I said simply. His mother, who had been watching in stunned silence, finally found her voice. "What are you thinking? Have you lost your mind?" "No," I replied, my voice steady. "For the first time in a long time, I know exactly what I'm doing." I turned to Ben, who was still fuming, but I didn't care. "I'm leaving, Ben. Emily and I are leaving. This is over." His eyes widened in disbelief. "You're not serious. You can't just leave." "I am serious," I said, my heart racing but my resolve firm. "I've had enough. I'm not your servant. I'm not her servant. I'm done living like this." His mother, still seated, let out a huff of disbelief. "You'll come crawling back, you'll see. You can't make it on your own." I looked at her, feeling nothing but pity. "Maybe that's what you'd like to think, but you're wrong. I can make it without you, and I will." With that, I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving them both behind in a stunned silence. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I went to Emily's room and gently woke her up. "Hey, sweetie, it's time to go," I whispered. She blinked up at me, confused at first, but then she saw the packed bags and understood. "Are we leaving, Mom?" "Yes, we're going to Grandma and Grandpa's," I said, smiling down at her. "We're going to be just fine." I grabbed our bags and we headed for the door. As I reached for the handle, I heard Ben's voice behind me, weak and pleading. "Susan, wait. We can talk about this." I stopped, but I didn't turn around. We've talked enough, Ben. I've been talking for years. You just weren't listening. With that, I opened the door and stepped outside, the cool air hitting my face as I closed the door behind us. It wasn't easy to leave, but it was the right thing to do. For me and for Emily. And as we walked away from that house, I felt lighter than I had in years. With each step I took away from Ben's house, I felt something shift inside me. The burden I had carried for years, the constant pressure to be someone else, started to lift. Emily held my hand as we walked down the driveway, our bags slung over our shoulders. The cold air was crisp, refreshing in a way that reminded me of the freedom I was heading toward. I glanced down at Emily, who looked up at me with those big, trusting eyes. She was quiet, but I could see the relief in her face too. She didn't understand everything that had happened, but she knew enough. She knew we were leaving a place where we had been treated unfairly, a place where her mother was never valued. As we made our way to the car, my thoughts drifted to what lay ahead. For so long, I had let go of the life I once had, the person I used to be. I had given up my career, my passions, and even my voice, all for the sake of keeping the peace. But today, that old version of me felt closer than it had in years. I had found my strength again, and with it came the determination to rebuild what I had lost. I thought back to the early days when I worked alongside Ben, before Emily was born. I was good at my job, better than good, actually. I had been confident, driven, and sure of myself. That woman still existed inside me, and now I was ready to let her back out. I would start working again, piece by piece, and slowly rebuild the life I had put on hold. Not just for me, but for Emily too. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, I knew that much. I would have to face the challenges of starting over, of finding my place in the workforce again, but I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. I had faced so much worse, and I had survived it. I could do this. As we pulled out of the driveway and began the journey to my parents' house, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. My parents had always been my anchor, the place I knew I could turn to when the world felt too heavy. And now they were welcoming us with open arms, ready to help us start this new chapter. I stole a glance at Emily, who was watching the trees go by through the window. I smiled, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. This wasn't just a departure from a house, it was a departure from the old life I had been trapped in, a life where I had lost myself in the process of trying to please everyone else. Ben had always assumed I needed him, that I couldn't manage without him. But he was wrong. I had given him so many chances, so many opportunities to step up, to be the partner I needed. He had failed every time, and now I knew I didn't need to carry the weight of his indifference any longer. There was no turning back now. The woman I used to be, the one who believed she had to stay quiet and do as she was told, was gone. In her place was someone stronger, someone who knew her worth and wasn't afraid to stand up for it. As we got closer to my parents' house, I could already imagine their welcoming smiles, the warmth of their home wrapping around us like a blanket. This was where we needed to be. This was where we would start fresh. I didn't know exactly what the future would hold, but for the first time in years, I wasn't scared of it. In fact, I was excited. The road ahead was mine to shape, and I was ready to take it on. With Emily by my side, there was nothing we couldn't handle. And as we pulled into my parents' driveway, I looked out at the familiar sight of the house where I had grown up, the place that had always made me feel safe. A new life awaited us here, one filled with possibility, with hope, with freedom. I turned off the engine and smiled. We were home. Months had passed since Emily and I left Ben's house, and life had changed in more ways than I could have imagined. The weight I had carried for so long was finally gone, replaced by a sense of calm and control over my own path. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. Every morning, I woke up without that nagging feeling of dread, without the constant pressure to be someone I wasn't. I had taken my life back, and it felt good. The first few weeks were challenging, of course. Adjusting to life without Ben and his toxic family wasn't easy, but each day I grew stronger. I started working again, picking up projects that reminded me of the career I had left behind. Slowly but surely, I began to rebuild the pieces of myself that I had lost. Emily was thriving too, free from the tension that had filled our old home. She smiled more, laughed more, and seemed lighter, just like me. But, as expected, Ben didn't take my leaving quietly. He called, texted, even tried showing up at my parents' house, full of apologies and promises that things would be different. "I can change," he'd say, as if those words could erase years of neglect. At first, his messages made me angry, then sad, and finally, nothing. I felt nothing. I had given him more than enough chances, and each time he'd let me down. His words held no weight anymore. I knew better now. I had learned the hard way that actions speak louder than words, and Ben had shown me, time and again, that he wasn't willing to change. He wanted things to go back to the way they were, where I did everything and he did nothing. But that chapter of my life was over. I didn't need his validation or his empty promises. I had found my strength, my self-respect, and I wasn't about to give that up again. I knew I had made the right decision, no matter how hard it had been. One day, after another string of desperate texts from him, I finally replied, "I'm not coming back. Please stop contacting me. We'll handle everything through the lawyers." It was short, to the point, and final, and just like that, the last tie was severed. It felt like a weight had been lifted from my chest. I had learned a lot through this experience. One of the biggest lessons was the importance of setting boundaries, something I hadn't done before. I had allowed Ben and his family to cross every line, to push me to the breaking point. But now I knew better. I knew my worth. I knew what I deserved, and I wasn't going to settle for less. Life after Ben wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I was in control now. I was making decisions based on what was best for me and Emily, not out of fear or obligation. It was empowering to know that I could stand on my own, that I didn't need to rely on anyone else to define my happiness. As I sat one evening watching Emily play in the yard, I reflected on how far we had come. The woman I had been in Ben's house, the one who tiptoed around, afraid to upset anyone, was gone. In her place was someone who had found her voice, her strength, and her confidence. I had chosen to break free from a life that wasn't serving me, and I had never been more sure that it was the best decision I could have made. Looking at my daughter, I realized that this journey wasn't just for me, it was for her too. I wanted her to grow up knowing her worth, knowing that no one had the right to diminish her. I wanted her to see that she could stand up for herself, that she deserved respect and love on her terms. As the sun began to set, I smiled, feeling at peace. Ben would never be a part of our lives again, and that was okay. We were building something new, something better. And every day I was becoming the woman I was always meant to be. The most important lesson I learned through all of this was that you can always start over. It's never too late to choose yourself, to choose happiness. And no matter how hard it may seem in the moment, walking away from the things that no longer serve you is the first step toward freedom.